All right, I'll just that's it. What's that? Right there.
Everybody, we're going to get started now. We're going to get started. So, find a seat, grab a snack. Welcome. Welcome back. Now we can start. Last year we can start. So we have, welcome back to Ipsos Tech. Mostly familiar faces tonight for sure. And then for those who are new, I think we've already introduced it. So I'm going to skip right past this. What is Ipsos Tech? Get right into the night. Welcome back to Rebel. And if you don't know me, I think most of you, I'm Brad. I work here at Rebel. We do hosting and domain names and all those things you need to get online. If you have any questions or anything like that. So tonight's a kind of special night. It's our 2nd year anniversary for Ipsos Tech. So that's 2 years of 104 meetings, and that's meeting almost every week for a couple of years. So that's quite a commitment. So to celebrate tonight, we have some food and a birthday cake. And last year, this time, when we celebrated our first birthday, we had about technology, about civic tech. And so we figured we'd follow up with that and see what Mike has to say this year. But before we do, let's do a quick round table. I didn't think of an icebreaker question. What do you think about this? Good icebreaker question.
What's your favorite thing to do when it's below zero?
Good one.
Is it officially below zero now?
-4 or
-7.
Yeah.
All right, it's my second. What's the best thing to do?
Centigrade. We have an American.
Lastly, we're live streaming. So if you don't want to be caught on camera, stay on that side of the camera. I'll turn around and we're all introducing ourselves. So this will be a little painful for Mike, who's on live streaming now, but we'll still go around and introduce ourselves. Starting.
My name's Sarah. I just moved to Ottawa in June, so I'm still working out what I like to do when it's below zero, but I'm thinking of doing baking.
Lucas, just names or are we doing like?
What did I say? Names and icebreaker?
Names and icebreaker? Cool. So Lucas, below zero, I'm a fan of walking but faster. It's a good way to stay warm. Mine's Paul, and when it's cold out, daydream about summer.
Yeah.
I'm Ruth, and I actually, in my old age, have decided I really like sitting on those metal park benches in a long coat while snow drifts down the gym. It's amazing what you can see people watching.
I'm Vanessa. I like cycling and having a nice long on my back in the winter. I'm Fatima, and I just love snow.
I'm Stephen. I like staying inside.
Matthew, I like to go snowboarding sometimes.
Hi everyone, Nick. I would like hiking for sure.
I'm Sanjam. I enjoy it. I enjoy skiing cross country and downhill.
I'm Carolyn. Just stay inside, watch a movie. you, Louisa?
Louisa, hot cocoa.
Hot cocoa, hot chocolate.
Yeah, like, and then stay home and be warm and all that.
Okay, my name is Noah, and what I like to do, mostly reading and writing. That's all I do.
I'm Doug, and I'm going to go for the hot chocolate, hot cocoa. Good strategy.
I'm Brett. I'll introduce myself. Yeah, I like outdoors too. So I like walking, walking through a nice quiet forest. This is a nice one.
Do you know what? It's nice to walk outside, but it's nice to come in and have a nice, thick, heavy beer as well.
Yeah.
It gave me an excuse after all the summer beers to sit down with something a little bit darker.
So I'm going to hand it over to Mike now, but help yourself to some snacks, and of course we have water and beer too, if you ask really nicely. And help yourself to the cake. Yeah, nice big heavy beer, cold beer.
Yeah.
But help yourself to the cake and the food. Okay, Mike.
Okay, thanks. So as Brett said, I was here last year, and I presented some work from a study we did called Canada Next, which largely looked at Canadians' views of technology and change and some of those, I guess it would be the best described as the tech side of civic tech. So I thought it'd be nice to this year talk about the civic side of civic tech and some of the things that are going on in the world. So there's nothing in here in how people feel about AI or automation or data or any of those things that I talked about last year, although we are going to redo that study, so maybe for your 3rd birthday and my 39th birthday, which is really stuck, I'll come back next year and talk about that. So I'm going to talk about, if you saw the intro, what these three people have in common. And at first blush, you would say not a whole lot, likely, given their political viewpoints, nationalities, place in the world. But in fact, I think they're all a product of the last couple of years of environment. I know when I do a lot of presentations, and I know, and I don't want to make judgments on politics, but I have a lot of people say, I really don't like what Mr. Trump has done. And I don't think he's done so much as he is the result of how the world has changed. He's taken advantage of it, for sure, but he didn't dream this up. Elizabeth May didn't create the issues with Brexit. She inherited them, and it was largely cast on its way before she ever got there. And Colin Kaepernick, while he did take a knee and started something off, he, if you looked at it, it's particularly the picking him up by Nike and running with him as a spokesperson, you could have seen coming down the road a ways. Younger people were less interested in voting and looking for different ways to have a social impact, disenfranchised from institutions, wanting to play a role, very keen on fairness and equity, a whole range of things. They were just looking for somebody to sort of to pick that up and champion it. And to Nike's credit, they read the tea leaves fairly well. What they have in common, whether it's populism, fake news, is a lack of trust in institutions that we've seen over the last over a decade or so, declining. Perceived ineffectiveness of our governments and institutions. It's not that they are, in fact, it's just that the public think that largely they haven't delivered what they thought. And that's resulted in some opportunities for different groups to take advantage of it. So I'll get into the details, and I'll work through populism and then some views on fake news, and then I'll wrap up with a couple of conclusions. So just on populism, as I said, traditional institutions have failed, or perception is they've failed. You can make all the arguments about the facts that you want about how things are much better now than they were 50 years ago, 30 years ago, and it's true if you look at purely the facts. But for the most part, people say, you know what, I don't think I've had the same gains as I could have or should have. I don't think I've had the same promises kept. The Canadian dream or the American dream hasn't turned out like I thought it was going to turn out. My income's been fairly stagnant. And I think the Brexit and Trump are in part a result of that. They're a reaction to it. Adding on top of that, an aging population and the pressures it's putting on our institutions, technology change, people feeling like they're falling behind the curve, getting increasingly antsy about, I just can't quite keep up with all the different changes in the world and what's going on, stagnant incomes. We're at a point now when you talk to a lot of young people, they say, I think I'm largely going to be paying for social programs that I'll never use, that may not be there for me or that they're there for an older population. They look at the boom in front of them and say, you know, will that ever be there for me? Will that ever catch up? Which is, if you think about it, really guts your decision to make an investment, either financially or in a vote in sort of the traditional institutions. We've largely always had left-right politics. Increasingly, we have politics that are split between, you know, populism versus the establishment. And I know everybody goes, but Donald Trump's not the populist, he is the establishment. But he has at least portrayed himself as part of the sort of the populist, the common man touch, the way he talks, a whole range of things. And he's been able to pull it off. I think that finding the middle ground has to become sort of the new goal of institutions. I think we are in real danger of losing that culture of consensus that we used to do, was to find sort of the middle ground and things would build around. The idea that we can find a path that doesn't make everybody happy but doesn't make everybody upset. Increasingly, the world is working at, I appeal to this group or that group, and then you move forward with it. So just some of the data. A majority of Canadians think that the economy is rigged, and they're skeptical that politicians care about them. We're not as bad as the Americans in this viewpoint, but it's still a pretty damning number when you think close to 6 in 10 Canadians say, I don't think political parties care about me. And think about, you know, the decline in vote, the number of people who don't show up, decline in political parties. Yes, the US is worse, but the people who think that, well, populism is going to happen in Canada, those pressures aren't here, I think we're just trailing them right now. The economy is rigged to the rich and powerful, 66 versus 57. Again, for people who are trying to make their way, get started, build economic growth in their portfolios, their families, etc. That's a pretty depressing thought. And right now, when you ask Canadians, sort of cast out, do you think your overall quality of life or your financial prospects should be better 10 years from now? Only half say that they're going to be better, which means the other half say status quo or worse. So, you know, how many people think that in the next 10 years your financial status is going to be the same or worse? Okay, so nobody in this room. But if I go into some parts of Canada, if I go into parts of the auto manufacturing sector in Southern Ontario, if I go into parts of rural Canada, just by sheer definition, I'm going to walk into a room and I'll pick St. Thomas because I'm from there, where about half the people, 3/4 of people say, yeah, I think it's going to be status quo or worse. So think about the motivation for those people to reskill, to deal with change, to invest in their community, to invest, to vote, all these things. When your gut is, in 10 years, I'm not making any gains anyway. So it's a pretty, someone said to me when I was putting some of this, does it get better? I look at it and you'll see at the end, it's sort of half full, half empty, depending on how you look at it. So. Almost half of Canadians believe the country needs a strong leader willing to break the rules. If you go down this slide, you can see the first question, at a time like the present, we should stick with sort of tried and true political parties. Those have been in power before. But we're at a point in our world where we need these people who have experience in parties. Only 19% agree, almost the exact same number as the US. So the notion that what we have had done in the past will work for us in the future, and is working for us today, not so much. 35% say it's too risky to elect political parties and leaders with radical ideas who haven't been in power before. So a lot more people say, yeah, I could accept that. They either fall in the neutral or they could accept sort of more radical parties than before. 46% say to fix Canada or the US, because we asked this on both, we need a strong leader willing to break the rules. Only 39% in the US. And that's because when we first asked this question a couple years ago, it's around 48, 49%. Since then, they've elected Donald Trump, and a bunch of people have swung back and said, oh, we got what we asked for. But remarkably, and this is the number, right? Trump has a 40% approval rating across the country. He's got like about a 80% approval rating among Republicans. He's holding very, very steady at 40% of the US population, despite everything he said, despite all the foibles, despite not going to Amherst to stay, a whole range of things. He holds fairly true to around 40%. Where anybody, if you just said, here's the list of things he's going to do in the first 2 years, they would say, yeah, he'll be down in the 20s, but he's not, so he's holding on. It won't get much lower. Half Canadians say politicians should be able to say what's on their mind regardless of what anyone else thinks about their views. You know, so when you look at Mr. Bernier and some of the things he's saying, you know, like him or not, there is a willing audience out there that's willing to listen to him, or at least accept that he has a different point of view, and I think people should be allowed to say what they want to say. Canadians express the least amount of confidence in our political parties. So this question is, how much confidence do you have in each of these organizations? And this is the answer of those who say, I have no confidence or not very much confidence. Down at the bottom, 74, 78% Canada, US, political parties, next left up, government. Big companies, the media, not very strong, the justice system, international institutions, and banks. Banks are also the group that we trust the most with our personal data, by a long shot, more than we trust government, more than we trust social media companies. That's not a big surprise. In large part because banks have a history of protecting the things we hold dearest next to our families, is our money. So banks have a history of protecting money. They have rules, they have regulations, they have processes that they follow. And so the assumption is the bank will do the same thing with my personal information. So if you followed any of the recent media coverage around Stats Canada, you know, and if you saw the presentation last year, some 80% of Canadians don't want their data shared without their consent. It's a big issue. And then when you think about, and I think it's an ownership control issue and a privacy issue, but even on a privacy security issue, do you trust the government? Do you have confidence in them? Not as much as I have in the banks. So that transfer from, and I know Stats Canada says they're an arm's length agency, but outside of this town in the Greenbelt, they're a government department in the minds of most Canadians.
So this stat really explains why that blew up.
Well, there's two things. There's one reason it blew up, and the other is people have started to figure out that the data that they provide through their day-to-day lives, be it through their phone or through social media, has value and can hurt them. And they want to have control over it. If you can sell my data, I would like a slice of it. And at a minimum, I want to know what you're going to do with it, and I want to know when you're going to use it. And so those demands are starting to bubble up, right? Where in the past, we didn't quite know what people had. So if you talk about, you know, The Economist had a cover story, I would say almost 3 years ago, data is the new oil, right? That data is going to drive the economy. Oil doesn't vote. Oil doesn't boycott. Oil doesn't get mad, right? Oil doesn't get upset when it leaks on the ground. But all of those things, data comes from people for the most part. It's your behavior, it's your changes, your financial transactions. So those things people do recognize that they belong to. So that's the other thing. And this is, do you actually trust them? No.
Would you say that there's a belief that at least with private enterprises, Canadians are very much aware that their data is being collected to sell them services, but they have an option to just say no. Whereas with the government, there's no upside, there's only downside whenever the government gets involved in the whole data collection business.
Yeah, I don't know that there's only a downside is how I put it, but there's no option, right? So you can literally decide, I don't want to go to coffee company X and then walk 2 blocks to the next company. Or because I don't like their service, or I don't want to go to this bank, I can go to that bank because I don't like their service, or I don't like their privacy policies, et cetera, et cetera. But you can only get government services. You can only get your health card from one place. You can only get your license from one place. You get your passport from one place. So the demands and expectations are higher in terms of that.
But it's like a monopoly dealing with
It's a monopoly, yeah. So. And then this is another one that I thought was interesting, just on the whole, sort of as the world is turning. You know, Canadians are largely seen as, you know, and we are very pro-trade, pro-immigration for the most part, although there's some cracks in that issue. But when you ask people just generally, do we need to protect ourselves more, or do we need to open ourselves up more, we're actually more protectionist than the United States right now. That doesn't mean that we don't want to trade, and it doesn't mean that we don't want immigration, but increasingly what Canadians are telling us is, I want to see rules, I want to see order, I want to see control, and I want to know that those rules and all that order and control are followed. on all of those things. So when we have trade rules and they get broken, and we go, yeah, but we're going to do this, that, and people go, well, why do we have rules anyway? When they see people crossing the border, they go, I understand that they're in need, but at the same time, we do have rules that we need to have to control.
Mike, do you think that it ever crossed anybody's mind when answering this question that it had to do, that their country needs to protect their data or their privacy or play a role there, or it's just we're talking like real protection?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I don't think people are quite that far along in sort of nationalistic protection of data, although I don't think they're that far away from that penny dropping for them either. I think there'll be a point where they go, well, hang on, who has my data? Where does it go? How is it shared? We aren't quite cognizant that of the value of data yet. We're starting. We used to give it away, we'd sign anything, and now people are a little more critical and concerned.
Yeah, I think we're probably just right on that precipice, and maybe some parts of the world are more advanced than Canada, even on that.
Yeah, I think we need to have a very long conversation in the country about, it's personally with you, about data, about the value, about ownership, about control, about how people feel, almost like the royal commissions we used to have on aging and some of those things, where we actually have to discuss like what roles are going to play and where are we going to go. Sorry.
I don't know if you're going to talk about it next, but is there any studies on how much the media is talking about sort of protecting your data and privacy?
I don't have that in here. I mean, it is starting, obviously, and I think that the Stats Canada is a pretty good example, right? Where I think 4 or 5 years ago that goes through, right? I think it goes largely, I wouldn't say unnoticed, but largely like, yeah, Stats Canada, they need this, that, and it moves on, right?
Well, I'd be interested to know what's the 25 countries. Are they similar to Canada? Or?
No. So we do our global advisor study runs every month, and it ranges, literally from Saudi Arabia and China through to Canada, the UK, Belgium. The mix of 25 countries, there's about 20 that are core, changes a little bit, and it's not a global view because we don't survey the world,
right.
But it is not 20 Western democracies either. Okay. Mexico's in there, India's in there, Saudi Arabia's in there, Chile's in there. It is a pretty good mix of the G7 or the G8, the BRIC countries, and then other countries. And then our monthly questionnaire, we add countries on or off depending on what we're talking to them about. So fake news. Donald's favorite rant. It's funny because right now I think we have a wider range of information and information sources than ever before, but probably less confidence in the content and the evidence that we can find than ever before. So while we have this huge amount of data or information, we question pretty much all of it because we're not sure about the sources. This sums it up, less trust, more lies, lower knowledge, and this isn't unusual, but almost everybody says, I think other people aren't as smart as me. There's other people out there getting fooled by this. So that's pretty much a human reaction. That we don't think we're nearly as bad. You ask anybody about their physical fitness or range of things, right? They'll tell you, well, I'm in pretty good shape, but the rest of my community, they need to do some work, right? I'm pretty in tune with the full fake news thing. I figured out, but I can tell you, all people on that side of the camera, you got some work to do, right? So that's just normal human reactions. You don't want to point out yourself. We often ask both sides, and it's somewhere in between there. So you can take a bit of a grain of salt when people say, I think I'm okay. I said there's no such thing as truth anymore. People increasingly being driven by sort of confirmation bias. So you can go find any evidence to support what you already feel about the world and how you view the world. Obviously, there's truth. There are things that are real. You ever play the game true or false? Yeah, in the future it's going to be true or perception. Because it's not about whether it's wrong, it's just about whether other people believe that it's right. right? And so that's why, you know, if you watched the lead up to the midterms, Trump's rant about the caravan moving into the U.S. via Mexico, all he had to do was talk about it, and he created it as an issue. Nobody thought it was going to happen, but yet there was tons of coverage of it. Coverage has dropped since the midterm. He stopped talking about it. So it does work. It's wrong, or as incorrect as it is. About 7 in 10 Canadians believe that the average person lives in a bubble, but not me. Only about 3 in 10 of us think that we live in a bubble. Pretty much the same worldwide, in Canada or in the U.S., a little higher. We tend to think that, you know, people live in these bubbles. They only get information that they're looking for, that they already have, and that I'm not nearly as bad. Yeah.
So, Mike, do you think that that's a peculiarly Canadian thing or a peculiarly human thing, right? Because to some extent, I see it as the same sort of notion as our sanctimoniousness about human rights, right? I mean, all the times we have given other countries heck for their human rights record, and ours is really no better or worse, right?
The notion that we see ourselves in a different light than we see the rest
of the world. Yeah.
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, we did a study on childhood obesity about 10 years ago. And to a person, everybody said, my kids are pretty good. They meet the minimum or the maximum activity levels. They're in good shape. But the kid next door is never outside playing. He's never doing. So people are very quick to say, because no one wants to say, my kids don't get enough activity and I'm a bad parent, right? But I'm pretty quick to say, I've looked at the kid next door and he's a little bit chubby. And he's not getting nearly as much exercise as my Johnny is, right? And I think that's human nature. We don't want to point out our own flaws. So that's why we tend to ask this both ways, right? How are you doing? How do you think others are doing? And it's probably, the truth's probably in the middle there. If you actually sat down and talked to this 7 in 10 people, and you'll see later on, while 69% say this, I think it's the same number who said, yeah, I got fooled by a fake news story. And I figured it out. And that's only people who figured it out, right? There's other people who hadn't, probably got fooled by fake news, but didn't do the math or didn't do the work to figure out, you know, were they lying to me?
But something which also I should mention, that we have education to not behave, you know, naturally. So it's education. So when we educate people, when we aware them about these kind of the natural processes, so maybe we can mitigate that kind of the processes, natural processes.
Yeah. Interestingly, in a lot of this data, education doesn't make any difference. High ed, mid ed, low ed. It's pretty flat, the whole views. There's a couple points, and I'll show them to you, but it's not as a decisive difference as I would have thought anyway.
Sorry, Mike, I was waving past you.
I thought it was a puppet. Canadians lack confidence the average person even knows what real news is. I'm confident the average person in my country can tell real news from fake news. Only 4 in 10 of us say, yeah, I think they can do it. I'm confident that I can tell real news from fake news up to 64%. I think I'm better at spotting fake news than the average person in my country, 54%. So similar trend where, you know, I'm pretty good, but everybody else, but not overwhelmingly in bringing endorsement numbers. You can understand the concerns around fake news, and you can understand if there's that much angst around it, that much doubt around it, these numbers, why politicians, media, anybody is putting out alternative facts, for lack of a better description, because it works, and it is having an effect. Half of Canadians believed in a fake news story. So, yeah, this is the one, you know, I thought I was fooled, but then I figured out that I really was. I found out it was fake, 48%. So that's people who actually went down the path and actually went and did the homework and found out, oh, the numbers were wrong and I was fooled. It's probably much higher than that in real terms, because you don't know it's fake if you didn't figure it out. And this one, the higher educated you are, the less likely you are to say you've been fooled, obviously. Right? I got that all figured out. But the lower ed are much more likely to say, yeah, I was fooled. Most Canadians question whether the average person cares about the facts even. 62% say, I don't even think they care in my country about facts anymore. All they want to do is believe what they want to believe. Which is pretty damning if you think about it, right? That, you know, there's been and I don't know the name of the study, but there was a study in the U.S. of longitudinal study, and there's much more polarizing there, and everybody's Republican or Democrat because they registered. But if you were registered Republican and you answered the survey one way, and then it was a longitudinal study, which means the same people answered the survey 3 or 4 or 5 times over the course of a couple of years, people actually early on said, I'm a Republican, and then their answers moved closer to the Republican stance over successive surveys, which meant I didn't change my views, but because I'd taken a firm position, then I am a Republican. So if I take a firmer position than I'm not, but if I take the firm position I'm anti-immigrant, then I will evolve and I will find evidence, and in future surveys, I will tell you things that support my view. So people are taking stances and then looking to defend them, as opposed to finding information and then making a concerted stance. The rush to judgment's very quick nowadays. I don't know if that's social media, I don't know if it's decline in trust, I'm not sure it's just the reality that people tend to say, no, this is where I am on the issue, and then I'll go and I'll find corroborating evidence. And it's easy to do. In the past, you would run into, this is where I am on the issue, and someone would go, no, but you're wrong. And you'd have to recant. Now you don't need to. Yep.
So, well, my question is, did you encounter anyone sort of talking about search algorithm? Because it is designed to give us what we want to see.
Yeah.
And if that have changed people's perception of
I think it's inevitable that it has, right? I mean, I don't get a lot of opera music in my algorithm feeds because I don't search for opera music, but I get a lot of roots rock, and I get a lot of blues, and so there's been a bunch of studies on news bubbles and whether they're in fact true. But for the most part, I mean, if it's anybody on Flipboard or used to be Zeit or any of those feeds, right, you get back more of what you look for, right? Everybody knows if you go in and you search Jamaica because you're thinking about vacation, suddenly all kinds of things from Jamaica pop up in your feed. So there is we didn't talk to people about that, but that is part of it. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I don't think you can underestimate, in particular, the social media rush to judgment. The first thing that popped into my head when you mentioned social media was the UBC accountability issue and the whole Stephen Galloway firing, right? Mm-hmm. 19 women are now being sued for defamation for comments that they made on Twitter, with no basis, in fact, whatsoever. Yeah. They hadn't seen any of the documents, they hadn't read even redacted reports, they didn't know who the main complainant was in the issue, right? UBC has already admitted to the tune of $200,000 that they messed up their investigation, right? So it's not just an echo chamber, it is a real rush to
there's a crowd piling on, right? There's literally a digital crowd out there that when everybody runs to one side of the boat, everybody else runs to look and see what's on that side of the boat as well. Yeah. And I think it's very human nature. It's just amplified in today's world. This question I find interesting. I'm confident I have a better understanding of social realities like immigration levels, crime rates, than does the average person in my country. We do a study every year called Perils of Perception, where we take real factual data, like the number of teenage pregnancies, like the number of Muslims in a country, and we ask people what they think the percentages are. And across the world when we do it, people tend to over-exaggerate the things they are worried about, or the things that they think are bad, and they tend to under-exaggerate the others. So, teenage pregnancies might
different, like the number of birch trees in the forest. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, like the Muslim population might be 3% in the country. People say I think it's like 40, right? But that's just their biases, right? So we actually issue a report every year. We crown a country. So Canadians associate fake news with stories where the facts are wrong, but also associated with sort of selective facts and as a discrediting term. So when we said to people, when you hear the term fake news, what do you personally think it is? And we gave them a couple of options. They could reply more than once. They don't add up to 100. So you get about 6 to 10 who say, I think it's just when you get the facts wrong. But you get a very similar number, close to half, say, I think it's when news outlets or politicians pick the facts that support their argument. So they omit some facts and they put things forward that actually work for them. And then about half of Canadians, a third worldwide, I think it's actually when they use it specifically to discredit the other side of the opposition. So there's no clear, I think people get it's a game. It could be a mistake, right? So I think there's no clear consensus that people are trying to manipulate things, but there's no clear consensus that it's not happening in that case either. So this one's a little harder to see, but if you look across the top, it's people often get a lot of things wrong, and it sort of, why do you think they get things wrong, like immigration, etc. People have a biased view of the world. They tend to focus on negative things. Sort of 55% of Canadians say yes, that's it. 52% say politicians deliberately mislead people. That's why there's a problem in the world. 52% the media actually deliberately mislead people. So when you go back to those questions at the beginning, when I talked about populism and the decline in institutions and confidence, when half of you think that the people who are running your country and the people who are informing you about the people who are running your country are misleading you, it's a concern. Social media misleads people, again, 52%. And then is it just people? Are people bad with numbers? Or is it the figures that are wrong? More often than not, the reason people get things wrong, according to Canadians and people around the world, is because someone is deliberately trying to mislead us, not because there are mistakes made in the numbers, right? So there's a Machiavellian game going on that people at least understand that portion of it. Whether they have the wherewithal to see through it and monitor it, we'll see. Majority of Canadians believe the average person trusts politicians less today than the past. And then the next line over is, do you think that there's more or less or about the same amount of lying and misuse of facts as there was 30 years ago? We tend to say more, so we trust them less. We think they're lying more. And then do you think the average person in the country knows more or less about politics? You see that if there's some optimism, it's here actually that in today's world, it's a little more balanced than I think we probably, while some people are saying less, almost equal numbers are saying probably more, right? So the problem isn't that you have access to information or people don't want to try. The problem is that people are gaming the system and trying to dissuade us or proceed us in different directions. So I'm going to shift to taking a stand on socialism. I think a lot of this we see in the Kaepernick, the Nike ad in Kaepernick. Despite or perhaps because of the lack of trust, people feel that the system is stacked against them. They think that there's other ways they can contribute. When you talk to people about what they do for their sort of set aside not corporate social responsibility but personal social responsibility, they'll tell you things like, I'll walk 2 more blocks to the Fair Trade Coffee Company because I know that my dollars are having impact. I don't know that what I'm doing, my voters and my roles and some of the engagement on the political level can have an impact, but I can make a change by what I buy. I can make a change by where I invest. And I think people are starting to clue into that. And now they're turning to companies, and as much as they may trust companies about the same as they trust governments, they think companies are much more effective than governments. Companies actually tend to get things done. Companies deliver new products. Companies get things delivered on time. Companies have great return policies. Companies work in terms of effectiveness. Governments have a hard time sometimes paying their population, their employees, depending on where you're from. So when people look at it, they go, so when that problem comes up, maybe it's not a bad thing to have a corporation, understanding profit motives, some of those things that I'm not as keen on, but having a corporation work on some of this stuff or take a stance isn't a bad idea. And I think that's why you see companies, 54% say they agree, only 20% disagree. Companies should take a public position on social issues like racism, sexism, etc. Now we asked this after the Kaepernick ad, without talking about the Kaepernick ad, but I think it really shows for that desire to see companies more engaged. And as you can see, it's pretty consistent across the board millennials, Gen X, boomers. It's not driven by younger Canadians or older population. It's fairly solid across the board in terms of wanting to do that. And I think we'll see more of that. We've seen more entrepreneurs, more social entrepreneurs, more people saying, I think if I start a business or I start a not-for-profit, I can have a bigger impact than political parties. Brett and I were talking earlier, I think the civic tech movement, and I think some of the similar type movements are in part because the political system has let us down, and the party system, right? If you go back 30 years, if you wanted to be involved in some way, shape, or form, you'd have all had to be in some way informed part of a political party, because that was the way you affected change. And today you can affect change by working with the Canadian Diabetes Association, volunteering there, for United Wave, coming to Yao Civic Tech, there's a whole range of things. So there are more outlets for that than there ever has been before, and there's more skepticism about political parties, in part because political parties were always designed to serve regions. And increasingly, we're all focused on issues, right? So we're bound together by where we live, we're bound together by our values, our views of the world, a whole range of things. So I think that will shift. So what does it all mean? If I do a glass half empty, change is the new norm. It just is. The world is going to continue to shift, change, roll over. When we can't find information that we believe, or institutions, or people that we trust, we will change. We will change the political parties. We will change the businesses we go to. We will move fairly rapidly, right? The whole notion that incumbents will always have a boost in going into the next government, it's going to get weaker and weaker and weaker. The long-term angst that we feel about it's the long-term angst when you talk to people. They can't put their thumb exactly on why they feel scared about the world, but that long-term angst will make us less likely to say, I'm going to stick with the guys we have. You saw that number, only 19% said this is the time we stay with tried and true political parties. There's a desire for change almost all the time now. As you effectively change your routes, you say, why won't we roll over and change the political system and the parties? I think clearly stated positions, choosing a side no matter what side, on a lot of key issues is going to become the expectation, and there's no way you can do that without creating more polarization. So as much as I may believe that what the Nike has done with Kaepernick is a great thing, what it did do was drive a huge stake into that community. And when you have people actually burning your apparel, those people aren't on your side, right? Now their gamble is, we're focusing on young people, this works for us marketing. But if you think about what they did, is they just nudged the US a little further in polar opposites, right? So while it may be a great marketing thing and their sales have gone up and their stock has gone up, they pushed a whole bunch of people into the I'm opposed to what they've done. So they polarize a little bit. Now, if that's for good or bad, that's just the reality. And clarity and conviction will, pardon the word, but trump consistency of actions in the short term. If you stand there and you say, this is right, this is why we're doing it, and you stand there and you stare down the media, it's going to work more often than not. Because people in this world don't fact check, they don't run around, humans don't, I know there are groups that do. And finding the middle ground is going to become a thing of the past in a depressing way. Those institutions that used to seek out consensus or seek out a path forward based on none of you is going to be happy, but everybody's going to be accepting of it, becomes less and less. Glass half full. We get to a point where we have fast, accurate, crowdsourced fact checks, and they become the norm, right? That those systems exist, people start to use them, people start to default to them. Something is said, and immediately people are not called for fake news or alternative facts, they're actually called liars. And they're ostracized. I mean, I don't know about you, but my dad would have smacked me upside the head every time I lied, right? That was one of the golden rules, right? You can break stuff, Mike, but don't lie about it afterwards, right? You threw a ball through the window, don't go, it wasn't me, because you will get caught, right? So mistakes happen, can't lie about it. That may come back, that you just don't have, you can't fudge the numbers, you can't pretend, because someone will be there to say, no, there's an authority figure. Media that report half-truths will lose credibility, be boycotted, lose revenue, so those will disappear. As information becomes better, knowledge will actually make decisions, including voting, based on evidence, rather than on ideology, which is what we're leaning towards now. And I think political parties have to change under that scenario, where they aren't left or right, or progressive or conservative, but they represent the will of regional or issue-based consistency. constituency. So they become much more and less ideological and more moving with the times. And we're finding middle ground becomes actually the new primary goal of most institutions. This is a pretty Pollyannish, optimistic view of the world. But that's, the art is there, the possibility is there, we have the information there, we have the technology there, and I think there's a public willingness there. It is whether institutions catch up to the current public willingness. Thank you.
Hey Mike, we have a question from the internet from this fellow Mike Gifford.
Is that Mike?
So Mike Gifford. Mike Gifford's asking, does polling have a responsibility for getting people to be more aware of their own confirmation bias? And how do pollsters work to avoid that when they are framing questions?
Yes. Does polling work?
Does polling have a responsibility for getting people to be aware of their own confirmation bias?
It's hard in a survey to point out people's confirmation bias, right? It's hard to, we have a limited number of opportunities, a limited number of attention span. We certainly try to create questionnaires and structures to get at is, are we getting confirmation bias, or are we getting sort of how people will really act? So we incorporate into a lot of our surveys now, not a lot, most of our surveys, behavioral science components, where we try to peel off sort of the real motivators, because people will tell you one thing but do another thing. I mean, I think that's been known for a long time, but it's getting more and more difficult as it gets a little bit, as it just gets more challenging. There's so many factors that affect people's decision, whether it's a purchase decision or a vote decision. In every one of our, and we do this stuff, so the Ontario election, Quebec elections, the US elections, Mexico elections, what else? We have run parallel studies of how we do traditional vote and behavioral science, looking at it slightly differently. We won't release any of that. It's all for us to know until such time as we're actually 100% confident that it is, right? We could run to the market and say, hey, we've just discovered this, but so we do have a due diligence where there's a science component to what we do. We'll run it over and over and over again until we're sure. And we'll come out, if we think we find a better way to measure things, we will. A lot of time we build, Mike's probably going, yeah, that is done well done. But a lot of times we'll build indices so we're not asking a single question, right? Because there can be a lot of variation in the responses to a single question. So we'll ask 4 or 5 questions around an issue. And the indices tend to take away some of that bias where you get some of the core. We also do a whole bunch of stuff that nobody ever sees on surveys, where we throw out surveys that are, I think it's like something like 10% of our surveys just get tossed because they're rote. So on a scale question of 1 to 10, where everybody goes 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, they don't get in. On an average questionnaire where it's 10 minutes, if someone does it in 3, that doesn't get counted. On an average questionnaire where it's 70 minutes, someone does it, we don't do 70 minutes, but they'll take 70 minutes, that doesn't get in. So we do a lot of work to make sure that the questions are actually answered by legitimate people. We had a guy named Hitler on our panel for the longest time, but we couldn't figure out who he was. So his data never made it in, right? Like, because we actually make sure we have real people who do it. We have screeners for bots. There's a whole bunch of stuff on the polling world that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that we're not driven by, I think in the U.S. 20% of the social media traffic in the last election was bots, and bots answer surveys too, right? So we have to screen them all out.
I have a really directly related question. The data that underpinned a lot of what you just showed us, you mentioned at some points, like, a question was a new survey that just came out like after the Kaepernick ad. You mentioned that like some things were coming out at different times. Do you have sort of like a general slide that you could show us about the foundations of the data that a lot of that was built on?
I don't in this deck.
Yeah.
So, but it all comes. So it is all based on surveys of 1,000 Canadians done online, predominantly through our panel. Okay. Global Advisor is a global platform that we run. We run it in the 25 countries. In 20 of those countries, it's a survey of 1,000 people, and in a couple of those countries, only 500. And in all but India, China, Saudi Arabia, there might be one other in there, it is national samples. So in those countries, in India, you can't do a national sample online, so you get it, Mexico might be, you get a skewed higher ed, higher income order, and just the realities of online. The cost to do telephone is astronomical compared to that, so we factor that in. But online's pretty good in all those other countries.
So then for some of the sort of, I'm going to say that insights that you drew, which maybe weren't specifically from the data about things like fake news and whether or not bubbles exist,
yeah.
Do you then give more context to your work by drawing on academic research, or
so,
how do you?
So we do, just in the shop that I run, about 300 client studies every year in and around a whole range of issues. And then around that, in order to be able to help our clients understand the world, we do ongoing context work around how do people feel about the economy, have pressing issues that we do on our own, that we do ourselves. And then around that, we do things like Canada Next, and some trends work that are longer term future things. So we try to make sure that we can take our clients' data and put it in a picture of what's happening in the world, as opposed to just saying, here's your data. Right. So when I do, and I've been doing this so that you know, I worked in the federal government for 12 years, and I've been doing it with these guys for 22 years, always in this space. So some of this is just stuff that's stuck in my head. But we're out there every day talking about these kind of issues and how they affect our clients. And it's amazing. There's just people say, well, yeah, you do much stuff for government. We do a ton of stuff for the private sector who are interested in things like future of work. Immigration is a massive issue for the C-suites in this country because it's where their market's going to come from. It's where their workers are going to come from in the future, right? So the last thing, if you sit down with anybody who's a senior executive, they want to see is Canada go back to a space where we're bringing in fewer immigrants, or we're just doing middle class, and we're not bringing in skills. So it's very important for them to have a conversation about some of these issues.
So when it comes to fake news and like what these media outlets push to us, like I'm a firm believer in free speech, but I also believe that you should pay for what you say, right? So like, what's your
take? Pay for what you say.
You should pay for what you say. So if you say something crazy, there should be consequent repercussions for that, right? So like in terms of fake news, like what's your take on like what happened to Alex Jones and World Wars, like how he got demonetized? Like should that happen to him, and like how does that play into what happened with your survey? Like Canadians get access to his, I'll say it. But like, is what happened to him fair? And does that have an impact on how Canadians answer your survey?
So everything has an impact on how Canadians answer surveys, because you can't pull people over the world.
Well, there's no Canadian Alex Jones. So that's my comment.
No, but we consume more peer-generated content and more U.S. content than we do Canadian content by a long shot, right? Like we get more things from our friends who get things from CNN and friends. So are we streaming him as much as they are in some parts of the U.S.? No. Do people probably know him and have they seen it? For sure, right? But so I'll take the counter, right? I'm a firm believer in free speech, and I don't think you can know good without knowing bad. And I think that if our society is so weak that one person with a megaphone can upset it, we're in a lot of trouble. Like that's a core, right? I don't know. There's a book out. I haven't read it yet. I'm trying to get a hold of it, called Anti-Fragile. And the premise is, like, I got the guy's name somewhere back there. The premise is there are fragile things in the world, and there are resilient things in the world. Fragile things, when they're stressed, they fall apart, and there are resilient things like rocks that don't fall apart. And then there are anti-fragile things that have a lot of fragile components, but almost always, once they break down, they get stronger as a result. Muscles, but not the kind of meat. And I'd like to think that our society, our economy, democracy, information systems are anti-fragile. We're stressed right now. There's no doubt about it if you look at these numbers. There are some serious concerns about where the world's going. But if you're really confident that we're doing the right thing, that our values are correct, we probably come out of it better than we did in the past. right? If you think about it. Now, maybe 10 years of Trump-like activities and 10 years of populism, Alex Jones and things like that, that is horrible at the time. But if you really believe in that humans find a better way, and the history has been net better, right? We've never, we're better than we were 25 years ago. Technology played a whole range of things, health, education. It's a fine line. I don't. That doesn't. So I like freedom of speech, not hate speech.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's where he crosses the line.
Well,
Right?
he's out of control, but like.
Yeah. But I thought Bannon should have been able to talk.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So it's
I'd
that.
I'd rather know what he says than
Exactly.
not.
Yeah. It's that line. One of the questions we asked people. We have a wide range of information. That question about immigration, we asked people because we were doing the global piece. Which country do you think is most accurate in guessing about things like immigration and those kind of things? Canadians said that we were second. 17% of Canadians said, I think it's us. And any guess what country they said was more accurate than Canada?
US.
Sweden. Everybody lives in Sweden, right? Least accurate. Anybody guess who the least accurate? US. And Canada's second. So we always sort of focus on ourselves as well. But 6% of Canadians said, I think, we're the least accurate.
So is it because the nation has no skin in the game that they will be more down the middle in terms of reporting news? Like, is that factual? Or is
No. This is just perception.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But like, where would one go for completely down the middle reporting as a Canadian?
That's a very good question.
What's down the middle?
Yeah. You're all here, so I'm going to assume that you're all on the hyper-engaged side of the world. How many follow news sources and people that you absolutely don't believe and don't think are on the right track? See, that's a little shocking to me. The very first thing, right? I follow people who I just do not believe at all because I want to know what they say, right? I follow the left, I follow the right, I follow a whole range of things, and I have to force myself. And I'm in a, I might want to say, I'd probably be one of the people who say, no, I'm not in the bubble, but I'm absolutely in the bubble, just by virtue of who I am.
It's a humble brag, but like I follow Milo Yiannopoulos, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and Fox News, and Alex. I was following Alex Jones.
Yeah.
And for Alex Jones, it was more entertainment because the shit he says is out of control.
Yeah.
But like watching Fox and guys like Ben Shapiro, they're right every now and then, but where they screw themselves up is they go too crazy, right?
Yeah.
And then, but if you get into that echo chamber that buzzword was thrown out tonight, then you can go down that Fox News rabbit hole and never come back. Now, I have friends that have gone down that rabbit hole, right? And they're lost in space. They're not. And I watch CNN, and like I'll believe a little bit what they say, but then they'll just say something else to do with Facebook, right? And then I'll go to Politico.
Yeah.
The fact-checking website.
Yeah.
And then I got my bubble burst about 2 months ago because they said even that website's shit. So it's
but where do you go for the truth?
Well, you can't.
Right. And there is no arbiter of truth anymore, right? There used to be, it is or it isn't, and not just because there's so many sources. I mean, everybody can create news. Everybody can. Hell, they even let me write op-eds occasionally. Like anybody can do this now. And in the past, there were gatekeepers who, was it bias in the past? Probably, but they were trained. You're nodding yes, but we didn't know because all we got was I'm old enough that I remember when the National Post came along. People were like, "Oh my God, we have a right-wing newspaper in Canada." Right? Like that was a concern that suddenly, and others were like, well, it's about time we had another perspective in the world, right? Now, the other thing with this is the other side of it is the news has got like this, right? The economics of news collection and reporting has fallen through in large part because Craigslist and eBay killed the classified ads, and we couldn't pay journalists anymore. So what's happened is the money spent on objective reporting has gone down. So you have more opinion, I think, more opinion reporting. You have, and they're having the same deal that everybody else is. I spoke at a conference with Craig Oliver, who's not a young cub reporter, and he said, today's reporters, they got to file X number of social media stories, You know, because it used to be you started in the morning, you filed one story at the end of the night. And you had time to go talk to people. It was still a compressed day. You had time to go talk to people. You had to go time to find both sides. You had time to put together a balanced view of a given issue. Because now you have to be the first to make the comment, first to publish, first to write, and you know all of that leaves us with a very shallow slice of the world. I think. Optimism. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, but I mean, to build on your point, everyone should have put their hand up in answer to that question. Who follows fake news and both sides? Because you don't know anymore. And I mean, especially taking the National Post as an example, I have read sponsored content that was not advertised as sponsored content. And I'm looking at it from a PR and a journalistic perspective, and I'm going, who actually paid for this? It's some drug company, but I don't know what drug it is that they're trying to promote. And they're not making that transparent. In terms of who's fact-checking, you know who's fact-checking in terms of publications these days? The United Church Observer, and that's about it. They're also pretty much the only Canadian publication that's paying people $1 a word, which is what journalists were getting back in the 1980s, right? When Canadian Business and Saturday Night and all those other magazines actually used to have a fact-checking department. It's bizarre.
It's the Wild West.
Yeah, it's you know, I have never, and I mean, it's not just the writing that I do, it's when I do transcriptions for other writers, right? And they tell me what they go through in the fact-checking process.
But don't you have some hope that the next generation, I mean, not my generation, but my kids, will have a much more critical eye and a much more discerning view of the world, and will look at this stuff and say, bullshit.
I'm concerned, I think we're in a positive loop.
In a positive loop?
I think, well, I mean, like, the loop's not going to break.
Oh, okay.
Like, I
it
don't
doesn't get
see it as getting better. Like,
we just spin out of control.
Yeah.
Because it's need energy and time.
Yeah.
And if you are busy with the work, and our recent life is more busier than our previous life. For example, I think the people who lived 40 years ago, 50 years ago, mentally at least, they were less busy than now.
You think we're busier?
I think yes.
Think about the things that save us time now. Right? And we're about to get a whole bunch more time. Once we get autonomous vehicles.
If we like to think we're busy.
We're going to have so much time on our hands. The average person, I was just reading this the other day, I think in Canada it's 26 minutes or 28 minutes the average commute, which is like, if you add it all up, I think it's 9 days a year. So once everything's autonomous, which is going to happen probably in my lifetime, I'm going to have 9 more days a year to read or buy stuff online, or watch Alex Jones, but to consume things that I never had before, so I'm not going to have to drive. Like it's.
But we have a tendency, if we are also become more free, we have tendency to fill it with some fillers, something which is easier than something analytical. We don't want to go for something analytical or a little complicated.
I guess what gives me hope is the Parkland kids from the Florida shooting, right? They got the media's attention, right? A bunch of teenagers, and they held it for weeks. So
David Hogg was on TV the other night talking about the midterms. So they're not going away.
Yeah, and so if we got that kind of engaged group of next generation who start questioning the fake news, we may be able to break your infinite cycle.
Yeah, no, I hope you're right. I don't know how technology fixes this issue without infringing on free speech. That's the issue.
But maybe it's not a technology.
Well, it's who's the tiebreaker? That's the issue, right? Is it person or is it machine?
Actually, to build on what you just said, I really love that. Actually, question here. So at the very end of the slide, there's something that says a media that report half truth will lose credibility, be boycotted and lose revenue, right? And then, my question is this, right? And then, but still human bias, right? It seems to me that most media actually report half truths in one way or another, in one topic or another, right? I think just what he said, right? So it's like even there is even this website that kind of gives a rating to all the major news to all the major news sources, right? And then sometimes CNN is even lower than Fox News, right? So then that gives me the impression that actually, most media report half truth, right? More or less, right? So then, isn't that, kind of becoming like, to the public, I actually have no idea how I can actually do it, if at all, right? And then because it seems that it's very costly for me to do everything to do the fact checking myself.
Yeah,
right?
well, and this is, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
This is my positive slide. This is what I hope happens, or aspirational.
So then the question is then what could be the speculations on how we could actually eventually lead to this, right? Lead to media being losing credibility, being boycotted, and losing their revenue. Any speculations on that?
Well, I mean, they'll I hate to say it in this group, but there'll be a tech answer to some of this. That'll help decipher. There'll be crowdsourcing. There'll be the ability to say, how fast can people around the world network say that Alex Jones is full of it, right? If you think about it that way, right? If there was a concerted effort, now the problem is Alex Jones goes unchecked. The people who follow him support him, so that confirms their biases.
Yep.
Nobody opposed to Alex Jones follows him and is actively watching, very few,
right,
and is actively saying, I'm going to actually, the time I watch him, call him on it, and have another channel that's the anti-Alex Jones that says, no, here's all the things he said that are wrong or incorrect, right?
Well, the juice boxes aren't making your kids gay. Like, this is pretty good, but the thing is that there's people who believe that. You know what I mean? Like,
but people will believe almost anything,
yeah,
right? I mean, I remember my
that's true, by the way. He did say that.
Yeah, my res fellow in First University said the great thing about Frosh is if you tell them they're a car enough times, you'll be able to drive them home by Thanksgiving. If you imprint on people, you tell them enough times, they're impressionable at different ages, right? You are, and I think the same goes for politics and news, and whole range of things.
You'll need I think your answer, going back a couple minutes, you said that, I do agree that technology will have to help in this. I think right now we don't own the intellectual property on the machine learning that's feeding us the news. Like, we rely on Facebook and Twitter to curate this for us. I think once we understand, or once someone comes up with that technology where you can start to tweak your own, say, news stream and machine learning, and then you can start to trust it, then, and it balances out with crowdsourcing, then you're going to start to feel a little more confident, as long as you own what that algorithm is.
Yeah.
But I mean, all the truth is out there, right? It's just not all together in the speed that you want.
Is that if every screen, when every politician or news person was talking, had a red, yellow, or green light on it, right? And it would just be red when they were full of it, according to the algorithms. And every now and then they'd veer to yellow and be like, okay, so there's some question of whether they're just fudging things. And then green, actually, no, they're telling the truth now, right? Yeah. You can vision that. I mean, I'm not a techie, but I think if you get to that space, you can get the confidence, you can get people to believe, you can get people to pay for that kind of.
Well, yeah. And then that's just it. I mean, that's the anti-Facebook. If you just say, okay, pay for Facebook, and you wouldn't have some external sources that will make them curate their list in their favor, not in your favor, then you now own it again. I think that the future is definitely one where we own our own Facebook, or you get into these groups where you know that you trust
and we used to do that, right? I mean, before Facebook, everything was curated, right? If you ran a music shop, you curated the selection based on the people who came in because you needed to sell. You ran a newspaper, you curated what you put in because you needed to sell. Right, everything was, before we collected data and sold what people did as a side business, everything was curated because you had to find a way to appeal to the group that you were working for.
Yeah, what would HMV look like if everything was free? You walked in and it was just purely given to you. Well, yeah, it wouldn't be based on your likes, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I don't see how what you described about what we used to do is any different than the bubbles that we exist in now. All curated content will have biases infused in it. It's impossible to get away from bias.
But it used to be used to anchor in economics.
Sure.
less so now.
You vote with your money, right? You vote, you choose the person, like the record store owner or the record store that would give you the best stuff.
Sure. Yeah. It's just a different bubble. It's just who.
Oh yeah, it's always a bubble. You're always going to only be able to get outside of where you can reach and walk to. But it's just whether you trust your bubble or if you own your own bubble.
I have also two questions. The first question is about the fake news. Sometimes maybe we are not dealing with fake news. Maybe it's what we have is that the different tone or different presentation or representation. So for me it would be fake news, for you maybe not.
Yeah.
Because if the tone or the presentation would be different, the way of presentation. For me it would be something that, oh, it's fake, but for someone said, oh, it's not fake.
Yeah.
So sometimes we are not dealing with the truth or with the news itself, but the way or the tone of the news. So that one I think is
so confirmation bias is you. So I used to have 2 clips. I used to work in the immigration department. I had 2 clips from the newspaper, same day, many years ago. And on the same day, 2 different reporters from 2 different papers wrote about the split between family class immigrants and skilled immigrants who were coming in the country. It was 40-60 at the time. And one wrote how they used the exact same numbers to argue the opposite sides. One argued we're only at 40% and we don't have enough family class, and that should be the anchors. And the other one, we're only at 60%, we don't have skilled workers, right? So there was nothing fake there, but they were both opinion pieces. But if you read them side by side that day, you're like, well, what is it? Right? These are the people I've looked to in the newspaper. At that time, there was, it was barely an internet. Those are people you look to say, these are opinion leaders, and they use the exact same numbers to come up with very different conclusions. So to your point, it doesn't have to be wrong to be missing.
Exactly. So this is more personal with your ideology. But the second question is about the company, because in one of your last data shows that people right now have more tendency toward companies than government. They think that the companies are more efficient when it comes to the efficiency compared to government. But did they distinguish between different companies? Because we are not one kind of company.
I'm just using a blanket term for companies, right? Companies.
Corporate.
The trust in companies varies greatly depending on what they do, their footprint, their history, their past, whole range of things. So there are companies that, like Hacknight, who've always had a forward-looking agenda that can take a stance and move it in space. I don't pick someone who can't. There are companies that's just not within their wheelhouse to make that kind of a political statement and get away with it. Hacknight took a gamble, and we'll see if it pays off longer term. But
I think it was a good gamble. I liked it. It's one thing we saw on social media was, because I follow both extreme sides, I saw like Fox News doing lots of stuff like, oh my god, people are burning their runners on fire, right? And it was funny because someone made the observation that, well, no one's burning their $300 Jordans. It's the Walmart and the aisle 90% on fire, right?
Yeah.
So Nike's hedged their bet.
Yeah.
And I think it's worked out for them. I think it's amazing.
But it does create more polarization.
Oh, absolutely.
It does drive a line in between these 2 populations. It doesn't do anything to bring people together on a fairly important issue.
Because it is an important issue.
Yeah.
So if we want companies to create more social good, or because we don't trust governments to do that, but how can we get companies to bring more people together rather than split them? Right, because if they have to take a stand on something, then they're going to split necessarily.
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting juxtaposition, right?
So how did companies go from trying to avoid picking sides, just trying to tightrope walk between this political rubble to actually taking sides? Do you see more companies doing that, or is that a strategic thing, or is this a tactical?
I think it's a strategic thing, and I think more companies will. I think lots of companies will.
Yeah, we saw what was it, about a year ago, 6 months ago? It was a question whether or not Shopify should carry the Breitbart store.
Mm-hmm.
They ended up carrying it, keeping it, because they're like, well, there's freedom of speech, and we're not going to start to put an opinion on it. But that's we're starting to, we're definitely seeing it come up.
Yeah. And I think those kind of moral and ethical decisions you get into the digital space and more people want to share things, are going to become.
But how about education and healthcare? Because companies in the long term, especially, can they be a good candidate for education and healthcare?
Can they provide education?
Yeah, because one of the main aspect of every company is profit, and when it's a profit, they need money profit.
Yeah.
And so if someone has the money, we receive a service.
But we have lots of, I mean, set aside Canada and the U.S., the vast majority of the U.S. healthcare system is for profit. Right. Now, they have issues with coverage, but if you talk to Americans, they largely get, they would say, better care if you have coverage than you do in Canada. If you can afford it, right? If you get a slippery slope of, do you want to support your population? There are all kinds of private educational institutions. Canada has lots of them, right? There's all kinds of privatized healthcare in Canada. You go to the Colledge clinic outside of Guelph, where all they do is hernia operations, completely private, paid for by the public, but run like a business, right? And they do one thing, they specialize in one thing, fixing old men's hernias. And they do so many, and they're so efficient at it, that it just doesn't make sense for anybody in Ontario to have a hernia operation anywhere else but there. Because they've got the cost down, and so why not? They've made it cheaper for the public system because they specialize, and yet they figured out a way to make money. So we like the whole notion that we have public health care. It's a little, how many, like most people don't have. Most pharmaceutical, most drugs aren't covered. Eye care is not covered. Dental is not covered. That's all sort of through your employer, right? There are huge chunks of the population that don't have any of those things.
So I'm a lot more concerned about the kind of fake news. I don't know whether anyone else in the room will have picked up on this story, but several months ago, maybe close to a year ago, there was a story about a mosque that was under construction in Montreal. Is this ringing any bell? And there were female construction workers, and the initial story that came out was members of the mosque were infuriated because females were working on their day of worship, which was Friday. It was complete fake news. It was totally taken down by a real reporter. We never found out who planted that initial story. I can't even remember what outlet it appeared in. I can't even imagine what the motivation was. Like, what was the motivation? To further discredit Muslims? I don't know, That kind of murkiness, that is what I think is really terrifying.
If you look at what, let's say Russia had a role in the U.S. But if you look at what they did, I don't think they so much tried to pick a side as just to create general angst and concern that you can't trust anyone. Right? The whole notion that you can't trust her is a pretty disabling thing for a country. Right? So if you create just doubt, you achieved a part of your goal in that space.
I think a lot of those news stories are too meant to be consumed, like as your eyes moves from like top to bottom. Not even like trying to read it, but sometimes your eyes aren't able to avoid it, and you're meant to just consume that little bit of the
It's
story.
just reading the headline, right? Nobody's meant to read the text.
Yeah, it's just meant for that. So you're not even meant to like be thrown off course. It's just going to plant a little seed of doubt, of fear.
Yeah, and it just builds up over time, right? I suspect we're going to see fake news in business. I think we're going to see businesses actually practice fake news very subtly, sort of without comment, discrediting the other client, other competitors' products or services or causing problems.
Well, that's been going on for years.
But now that there's so much more opportunity to do it, right?
Absolutely, yeah. We call it marketing math, right? Like how competitors calculate this and that, right?
Yeah.
We'll sit there and I'll look at my competitors and they're doing it, and I'll look at my colleague and I'm like, are you kidding me? And I was like, yeah, we're not going to go down that unethical route.
But more and more will.
Yeah.
Because it's more and more effective.
Yeah. And then I have customers who be like, oh wow, Paul, your company can't do this. I'm like, oh geez, here we go, right?
Yeah.
They took the bait, right?
Yeah. You want to turn that around to Mike? It's your brain.
Well, you know what? Actually, Mike signed off about half an hour ago.
So we can go good for Mike.
We can sign off, yeah. Cool.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot.
we're back here again next week. Folks, feel free to stick around and hang out for a bit. And yeah, so no speaker next week, but back here, hang out. Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry, one more thing. Tomorrow night, Louisa's holding an event here again, but Louisa, do you want to give us a little bit of an intro of what we're talking about? If you don't make it out tomorrow night, there's going to be others in the future, but it's really cool stuff though.
No puns intended. There's other future. Well, because today we are talking about the future, and tomorrow we are also talking about the future. And tomorrow we are hosting Speculative Futures, which is a designer critical opinion sort of kind of community. So tomorrow we're actually talking about building communities where people have a mindset to think more about the future and also incorporating that in their jobs. So particularly in the design world and communications world, but we also want to open up to people who are practicing in policy or other kinds of practices that influence people's lives on a daily basis. So if you're interested, come back here tomorrow, same time. I don't think we'll have food like that.
There'll be leftover cake. So
Okay.
come back for a cake again.
So yeah, like come by tomorrow if you want more future stuff, and we'll see you in the future.